Hey guys, tonight we're going to get very quiet and talk about soup. But not just any soup. We're traveling back to a time of damp castles, scratchy woolen clothes, and a truly baffling culinary obsession. We're talking about medieval European snail soup. Imagine the gentle bubbling of a cauldron over a low fire, the soft clinking of shells, a sound that has lulled people to sleep for centuries, just probably not on purpose. The sun has bled out behind the skeletal trees, leaving a bruised and tender sky. You're standing outside a small, wattle and daub hut as the evening chill begins to settle in your bones. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet earth, and a general, all-pervading dampness. This isn't some grand, cinematic vision of the past. This is just another Tuesday in the year 1250. Forget about grand feasts and knights in shining armor. Your reality is mud. And the most exciting thing on the menu tonight is something you found clinging to a decaying log. Honestly, you probably won't survive this script without dozing off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always nice to see where everyone is drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day is finally done. Your back aches with a deep, familiar fire from stooping over the meager rows of barley in the Lord's field. Your hands are chapped and raw, the skin split in places from the rough wooden handle of your hoe. As twilight deepens, the world shrinks to the soft, warm glow of the fire inside your small home. The single room is smoky, the air hazy from the central hearth that never truly goes out. A packed earth floor, cool beneath your worn leather shoes, offers little comfort. This hearth is the heart of your world. It cooks your food, warms your family, and keeps the deep, pressing dark at bay. And in your belly, there is that other familiar feeling, a dull, gnawing hunger. Food for you isn't about pleasure or variety, it's about fuel. Your diet is a monotonous, grueling rotation of pottage, a thick, soupy stew of grains and whatever vegetables you have, and coarse, dark bread that scratches the roof of your mouth. Meat is a ghost, a memory from the last feast day, a rare luxury that haunts your senses. But tonight is a little different. It rained this afternoon, a long, soft, persistent drizzle that turned the forest floor into a glistening carpet of new life and slow decay. And with the rain come the snails. You take a small wicker basket, its weave loose and frayed from years of use. You don't have to go far. Not deep into the dark woods where wolves and stories roam, but just to the edge, where the Lord's land meets the wild. Or perhaps you walk the perimeter of the local monastery, its damp stone walls a perfect man-made cliff face for your quarry. The world has dissolved into shades of gray and deep, wet green. You move slowly, your eyes scanning the undersides of broad leaves, the damp crevices of tree bark, the mossy flanks of ancient stones, and then you see them. Dozens of them. Their shells are perfect, silent whirls of brown and cream, glistening in the dying light. They move with a placid, unhurried grace, utterly unaware that they are the evening's featured ingredient. This is not a hunt. There is no thrill, no chase, no adrenaline. This is gathering. It is harvesting. A slow, methodical collection, your movements mirroring the pace of the creatures themselves. Each snail you pick up is cool and solid in your palm. You can feel the slight, wet suction as you pluck it from a leaf. It retracts into its portable home, a futile and reflexive defense. One by one, they make a soft, dry clacking sound as they drop into the bottom of your basket. This is the reality of the medieval peasant diet, a fact often lost in tales of kings and queens. It was overwhelmingly based on carbohydrates. Things like bread, oats, and barley, usually boiled into that perpetual pottage, were the bland cornerstones of existence. Protein was scarce, so any available source, a trapped bird, a string of freshwater fish, and yes, this basket of snails, was a vital, treasured addition to the pot. You aren't thinking about escargots de Bourgogne. You're not contemplating garlic butter and parsley. Such things are centuries away and might as well be from the surface of the moon. You're just thinking, good. something that isn't boiled barley for a change. You continue your slow work until the basket feels heavy enough in your hand. It's a respectable haul, enough for you and your family to have something substantial in the soup tonight. In some parts of Europe, the sheer abundance of edible snails like the Helix pomatia, or Roman snail, made them an incredibly reliable food source. They were essentially self-herding livestock, thriving in the damp, cultivated landscapes without needing any effort from you, except for this occasional rain-soaked stroll. Your pantry, in a way, was self-stocking. Back in the hut, the firelight makes the shadows on the rough wooden walls dance and sway. The basket of snails sits on the floor by the hearth. The journey is not over. In fact, the real work is about to begin. You can't just toss them into the pot. That would be a disastrous mistake, resulting in a gritty, bitter soup that tastes of dirt and whatever dubious vegetation the snail last enjoyed. They need to be prepared. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of snails was born purely from the grim necessity of staving off starvation, or if it represented a genuine, albeit humble, culinary tradition. Was this just survival? Or was it a recipe passed down from your grandmother? A small, slimy comfort in a very hard world? The truth, as it so often is probably a muddy, indistinct mixture of both. You look at the basket. It's not a chest of gold, but it is food. It is sustenance won from the damp earth. It's a tiny victory against the constant, grinding hunger that defines your life. This whole process is the original slow food movement, just without the celebrity chefs and the eye-watering price tag. The main ingredient literally defines the pace. The air grows cooler. The fire crackles and spits. The world outside is dark and full of unfamiliar sounds now. But in here, there is the simple, immediate task of preparing a meal. The journey of the snail from the forest floor to the soup pot has just begun. A tiny, shelled protagonist in the grand, boring story of everyday survival. You wonder briefly if the snails have any idea what's coming. Probably not. They don't have the neurological capacity for existential dread, which, all things considered, is a pretty good deal in the 13th century. You feel the weight of the day settle deep into your bones, and the gentle clacking of the shells in the basket is a strangely soothing sound, a quiet promise of a full belly, and with any luck, a night of deep, uninterrupted sleep. You sit there in the flickering firelight, the basket of snails a small, quiet promise of a meal. You might think this act, this humble harvest from the damp woods, is a tradition as old as the soil itself, born from an unbroken line of hungry ancestors. But the story of the snail on the European dinner plate, well, it has a much grander and frankly far more particular beginning. The thread of this recipe doesn't start in the medieval mud. It begins on warm, sun-drenched marble. Let's leave your smoky 13th century hut for a moment. Let the smell of wood smoke and damp wool fade from your senses. We're drifting backwards, letting the centuries peel away like layers of old parchment going back more than 1,000 years. The air grows warmer now, scented not with decaying leaves but with sun-baked dust, wild thyme, and the distant, salty tang of the Mediterranean. Welcome to the Roman Republic, an era of astonishing ambition, brutal conquest, and a truly meticulous approach to appetizers. Picture the estate of a wealthy Roman, a man like Fulvius Lipinus, who was, by all accounts, the first person to invent the snail farm. Near his villa, past the rooms with their vibrant frescoes and the courtyard with its gurgling fountain, there is a special kind of garden. It is called a cochlearium. It isn't a place for growing vegetables or flowers, but a dedicated enclosure for cultivating snails. A low stone wall surrounds a patch of shady ground, and just inside that wall, a small ditch filled with water provides a tiny, uncrossable moat. Sometimes the top of the wall would be polished so smoothly, the snails couldn't get a grip, or lined with a barrier of ash. No detail was too small to prevent the escape of the evening's hors d'oeuvres. This isn't foraging. This is precision agriculture. Inside this pen, the Romans didn't just let the snails graze on whatever they found. Oh no, that was for amateurs. The great Roman naturalist and chronicler of everything, Pliny the Elder, wrote about this practice in his famous encyclopedia, Naturalis Historia. He describes how different types of snails were kept in separate enclosures, sorted by species. It was a level of gastropod organization that would make a modern librarian weep with joy. The Romans knew that what a snail eats affects its flavor. So, they created bespoke snail food. A special mash made from spelt flour and boiled wine was a favorite, designed to fatten them up quickly and give their flesh a rich, complex taste. They were placed in special clay pots with air holes and fed this mixture until they were too bloated to retreat back into their own shells. Pliny, who was prone to the occasional wild exaggeration, even claimed that some of these snails grew so enormous their shells could hold 10 quarts. It seems Pliny the Elder was also a pioneer of the big fish story, just with a lot more slime. While we can probably take his measurements with a grain of salt, the core fact remains. The Romans were snail gourmands. They practiced a form of snail farming, known as cochlearia, to ensure a steady, high-quality supply for their elaborate banquets. And this wasn't just happening in Italy. As the legions marched across Europe, they took their tastes with them. In fact, historians still argue whether the famous Roman snail, Helix pomatia, the very same plump, delicious species you might find in modern French cuisine, was actually native to Britain, or if the Romans introduced it there specifically to keep their governors and generals well-fed and happy. Imagine yourself not as a medieval peasant, but as a guest at a Roman dinner party. The first course, the gustatio, is served. Alongside olives, eggs, and small sausages, a platter of snails arrives. They haven't been boiled into a humble soup. They have been roasted over hot coals until their shells are scorching hot, then drizzled with olive oil and a splash of garum, that pungent, beloved Roman sauce made from fermented fish. Or perhaps they've been removed from their shells, fried, and served on a skewer. They are a delicacy, a conversation starter, a sign of your host's wealth and sophistication. They were also considered a health food, recommended by physicians for everything from a persistent cough to stomach pain. But empires, like dinner parties, must eventually come to an end. As Rome's power began to crumble, so did its intricate systems. The aqueducts that carried water, the roads that carried armies and trade goods, and the recipes that carried culinary traditions all began to fail. In the chaos of the centuries that followed, the grand villas were abandoned, their mosaic floors covered by dirt and weeds. And out in the garden, the carefully managed cochlearia fell into disrepair. The walls crumbled, the ditches ran dry, and the snails, of course, didn't mind one bit. They just kept on doing what they do best, slowly, patiently, and persistently inheriting the earth. The pampered, wine-fed gastropods escaped their pens, venturing out into the wild. They spread across the continent, interbreeding with local populations, thriving in the ruins of the civilization that had cultivated them. They were no longer a curated product. They were just another creature of the forest and field waiting for centuries to pass, waiting for the memory of their time as a delicacy to fade completely, only to be rediscovered by your hungry medieval descendants, not as a luxury, but as a simple, desperate means of survival. The grand knowledge was lost, but the snails remained, carrying the ghost of a forgotten feast within their humble, spiraled shells. The pampered Roman snails slip away from the crumbling cochlearia into a world that is itself crumbling around them. They move at their own placid pace, utterly oblivious to the collapse of the civilization that had, for a time, made them a star. As they venture into the overgrown wilds of post-Roman Europe, they enter a landscape of profound and unsettling change. The centuries that follow the fall of Rome are a quiet, slow, and murky period of transition. You are living in that transition now. The world your great-great-grandparents knew, a world connected by stone roads and a common law, is a fading memory, a story told by old men. The great stone roads themselves, the arteries of the empire, are cracking. Weeds, patient and persistent, push through the paving stones. Tree roots heave the mighty slabs aside. Bridges, once marvels of engineering, sag and collapse into the rivers they span. The world's first superhighways were slowly being reclaimed by nature, turning into what we might today call aggressive hiking trails. A journey that once took a legion a week on a paved, protected road now takes a merchant a month, dodging bandits and navigating forgotten, overgrown paths. The world has grown vast and disconnected once more. This breakdown of infrastructure has a direct effect on your stomach. The intricate web of trade that sustained the empire is gone. The ships that once brought Spanish olive oil, Egyptian grain, and Indian pepper to the shores of Gaul and Britannia are, for the most part, ghosts. The globalized food network of the ancient world has shattered into 1 million tiny local pieces. Now you eat what you can grow, what you can find, and what you can trade with the next village over, and nothing more. The concept of an imported good is the stuff of fantasy, a luxury reserved for the most powerful kings and bishops. Flavor itself becomes a local phenomenon. The Roman pantry, with its rainbow of spices and sauces, is gone. Your world now tastes of wood smoke, of the iron pot that hangs constantly over your fire, of damp earth, and maybe, if you're lucky, of the wild garlic, mustard seeds, or thyme you can gather from the nearby woods. The complex recipes of Rome vanished. No one was flambeing anything. The only thing getting flambéed was the occasional village by passing raiders. Literacy itself has become a rare skill, and the great cookbooks like that of the Roman gourmand Apicius, with his elaborate instructions for flamingo tongue and stuffed dormice, are lost to all but a handful of secluded scholars. Knowledge of sauces, of complex butchery, of delicate seasoning, it all evaporates into the smoky air of a simpler, harsher time. So your diet simplifies out of brute necessity. This is the era where the monotonous pottage we met earlier becomes the undisputed king of your dinner table. It is the age of dark, heavy bread made from whatever grain you could grow. Barley, rye, spelt. Variety was out. Monotony was in. Your palate had about as much excitement as a meeting about regional tax codes. This is a core historical reality of the early Middle Ages. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire didn't just change politics, it fundamentally altered daily life, forcing the vast majority of the population back into a localized, agrarian, and deeply self-sufficient existence. And in this new, smaller, quieter world, you rediscover the snail, not as a cultivated delicacy prepared according to ancient recipes, but as a wild creature, a foraged food. You find it clinging to leaves after a rain, just as your ancestors did in Section 1. But now, its context has changed. It's no longer a holdover from a forgotten empire. It is a vital part of your own very immediate world. Archaeological evidence from this period paints a clear picture. At settlement sites, the types of animal bones found in rubbish pits begin to change. There are fewer bones from large, professionally butchered cattle, and far more from small, locally acquired animals. Birds, rabbits, squirrels, and in the right regions, piles of empty snail shells. It's a diet of opportunity, a history told by leftovers. The snail is perfectly suited for this new age. It requires no great road to travel upon, no merchant to trade it, no special feed to fatten it. It asks for nothing. It is simply there, a tiny shelled gift of protein in a protein-scarce world. It is the ultimate local food. Historians still argue whether the term Dark Ages is a fair or accurate description of this period. Many point to the continued innovation in agriculture, the rise of new kingdoms, and the vibrant cultural development happening in monasteries and royal courts. And they are right. It wasn't an age of total stagnation. But for the average person, for you, standing in the mud outside your hut, life was certainly darker in a literal and culinary sense. The world was less connected, less varied, and the flavors were far less bright. But in this age of fragmentation and simplification, some islands of the old world did survive. Islands of order, of learning, of stone walls and quiet contemplation. Behind these high walls, communities of monks were busily preserving knowledge, tending vast gardens and adhering to a strict set of rules governing every aspect of their lives, especially what they could and could not eat. And these men, the most literate and organized people of their time, were also looking at the humble snail. They were picking it from their cabbage patches and stone walls, not just for survival, but for a very different and very clever reason. A new and perhaps most influential chapter in the history of snail soup was about to begin. You step through the heavy oak gates of the monastery, and the chaotic, muddy world outside seems to vanish, replaced by a profound and structured quiet. The air here is different. It smells of beeswax, old parchment, baking bread, and the clipped herbs from the garden. You hear the distant melodic sound of chanting from the chapel, a sound that marks the passing of the hours with more reliability than the sun on a cloudy day. This is an island of order in the turbulent sea of the early Middle Ages. Life here is governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, ora et labora, prayer and work. Every moment of the day is accounted for, a rhythm of devotion and industry that has persisted for centuries. This rigid structure extends to the most fundamental of human activities: eating. The monastic diet is simple, meant to nourish the body without inflaming the soul with worldly pleasure. But it is also subject to a daunting calendar of restrictions. For the 40 days of Lent on every Friday of the year, and during numerous other vigils and fasts, the rules were strict. For potentially more than a third of the year, the primary rule was the complete abstinence from caro, which was defined as the flesh of warm-blooded land animals. The sizzle of roasting pork, the comforting richness of a beef stew, the simple utility of chicken, all were forbidden. For a community of hardworking men, this was a significant culinary and nutritional challenge. So the medieval mind, particularly the well-educated monastic mind, got creative. The forbidden thing was specific. The challenge, then, was to find things that fell outside that specific definition. The permitted category was, broadly, fish. But the medieval definition of fish was a wonderfully flexible and imaginative thing, operating on a system that had more to do with Aristotle and perceived environments than modern biology. The guiding principle was something like, if it swims or lives near water or just looks a bit weird and clammy, it's probably fine. This led to some truly remarkable classifications. Take the beaver. It has fur and 4 legs and looks suspiciously like a mammal. But it spends most of its life in the water, and crucially, it has that flat, scaly, fish-like tail. Therefore, at least the tail, and often the whole animal, was considered aquatic. It was a fish. You could eat beaver on a Friday. The same logic was applied to puffins and other seabirds, who spent so much of their lives on the water, they were deemed more of the sea than of the air. Perhaps the most charming example of this theological loophole cuisine is the barnacle goose. In the medieval period, no one had ever seen a barnacle goose nest. They simply appeared on the coasts of Ireland and Scotland every winter. People observed barnacles growing on driftwood, and some of these barnacles have feathery stalks that, with a bit of imagination, look like a tiny embryonic goose. The conclusion was obvious. Barnacle geese did not hatch from eggs like other birds, but grew from the sea like shellfish. It was a brilliant piece of biological deduction, completely wrong in every single respect, but absolutely perfect for getting a roast bird on the table in the middle of March. And it is in this grand tradition of creative zoology that you, as a monk, turn a thoughtful eye towards the snails diligently munching on the cabbages in your well-tended garden. Let's consider the evidence. The snail is cold-blooded. It produces slime, a substance of profound moistness. It has a shell not unlike a clam or an oyster. It thrives in damp places and appears in great numbers after it rains. It is clearly not a beast of the field or a fowl of the air. By every medieval metric, the snail is far closer in nature to a fish than it is to a forbidden sheep. The case is closed. The humble snail is permissible Lenten fare. Historians still argue whether this creative classification was a cynical attempt to get around inconvenient rules, a way to satisfy a craving for flesh while technically obeying the letter of the law, or if it stemmed from a genuinely different medieval understanding of the natural world, a worldview where a creature's environment and elemental nature were far more important than its internal anatomy. Either way, the result was the same. The snail, having been a Roman delicacy and a peasant's fallback, now entered its third act, a theological loophole on a single muscular foot. The monks, with their organized minds and communal labor, did not have to rely on foraging alone. The memory of the Roman cochlearium may have been lost to the world at large, but the practical need for a reliable Lenten protein source led the monks to the same conclusion. Within their secure walls, they could create their own snail pens, ensuring a fresh supply. The snail was now not just a creature of the wild, but a sanctioned, cultivated part of the monastic economy. And when it came time to cook them, the monks had an advantage. Their kitchens were large and well-equipped, and their medicinal herb gardens provided a wealth of flavorings, sage, hyssop, parsley, thyme, that the average peasant could only dream of. The monastic snail soup was a step above. It was a considered dish, a legitimate part of a complex and holy dietary system. But the monks' interest in the snail was not merely about filling their stomachs during a fast. In their worldview, nothing in God's creation was without a deeper meaning or purpose. And they saw in the slow, slimy, self-healing snail something more than just a convenient loophole. They saw medicine. That snail, sitting on a cabbage leaf in the monastery garden, was more than just a clever way to get through Lent. To the medieval mind, the world was not a random collection of objects. It was a book written by God, and every creature, every plant, every stone was a word in that book, filled with hidden meaning and purpose. If you were wise enough, you could learn to read the language of creation. In the realm of medicine, this belief was called the doctrine of signatures. It was a divinely inspired system of pharmacology that essentially turned a walk in the woods into a trip to the pharmacy, provided you were good at pattern recognition. The idea was simple and elegant. God, in his infinite mercy, had marked his creations with a sign, or a signature, to indicate their use. Similia similibus curantur, like cures like. You just had to look closely at the shape, color, or behavior of a thing to understand the ailment it was meant to heal. For example, the meat of a walnut looks like a tiny wrinkled brain, so walnuts were obviously good for headaches and strengthening the mind. The plant known as lungwort has leaves that are spotted and shaped vaguely like a lung, so it was the go-to remedy for pulmonary complaints. It was a simple, elegant theory. Unfortunately, it did not extend to suggesting that eating rocks would make you stronger. Now, with this doctrine in your mind, you look at the snail again. It ceases to be just a slow-moving mollusk and transforms into a walking, or rather sliding, apothecary of potent signatures. Let's start with the most obvious part, its shell. You are in the monastery's infirmary now, a quiet, clean room that smells of dried herbs and beeswax. You take a dried, empty snail shell, pearly and brittle in your hand, and place it in a heavy stone mortar. As you grind it with the pestle, it breaks down into a fine white powder. This powder is for mending. The shell is the snail's house, its armor, its skeleton on the outside. Its signature is one of protection, structure, and repair. Mixed with a little honey or lard to form a paste, this powder becomes a key ingredient in a poultice applied to help set broken bones or protect a serious wound as it heals. But the true magic, the most potent and enduring signature, is in the slime. You watch a living snail make its way across a stone. It leaves a glistening, silvery trail behind it, but if you come back in an hour, the trail has vanished without a trace, the stone left clean and unmarked. This trail is a signature of renewal, of seamless healing, of making things whole again without a scar. So, the snail's mucin became a prized ingredient for the skin. You see a patient with a nasty burn on their arm, the skin red and angry. A thin, cool layer of snail mucin is gently applied. It is soothing, moisturizing, and believed to speed the healing of the flesh. The same logic made it a treatment for rashes, dry skin, and even as a primitive cosmetic to smooth wrinkles. A particularly widespread folk remedy involved taking a snail and letting it crawl all over a wart. The belief was that as the snail's slime trail on the wart dried up and vanished into the air, the wart itself would wither and disappear. A much gentler approach than some of the alternatives, and it gave the snail a nice day out. This medicinal view was also woven into the period's dominant medical framework, humoral theory. Health, you believe, is a delicate balance of the four humors in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor has qualities of temperature and moisture. A healthy body is in perfect equilibrium. Sickness is an imbalance. A fever, for instance, is an excess of heat and dryness. And the snail, a creature of the damp, cool earth, is obviously a being of profound cold and moisture. Therefore, a warm, nourishing bowl of snail soup is the perfect prescription. It is a cooling, moistening food, designed to counteract the patient's fiery imbalance and gently restore them to health. Historians still argue whether these remedies were purely based on such philosophical principles, or if some of them were coincidentally effective and rooted in generations of observational folk medicine, with the fancy theories applied later as a justification. We now know that snail mucin is rich in compounds like hyaluronic acid and glycolic acid, which have scientifically recognized moisturizing and regenerative properties used in modern cosmetics. It seems that sometimes the doctrine of signatures by pure chance or keen observation actually got it right. So the humble snail was now fully integrated into the medieval world. It was a Lenten loophole for the hungry soul and a potent medicine for the ailing body. This dual-purpose status cemented its importance, making it a creature worth seeking out, and the effort to bring the snail from the wild to the table, or to the infirmary, always began in the same place. It began not in the kitchen with the chopping of herbs, nor in the apothecary with the grinding of shells, but outside the high stone walls. It began with a basket, a patient eye, and a slow walk through the quiet, damp places of the earth. So you take your basket. It could be a gray, pearly morning, the world still wrapped in a damp shroud of mist, or the cool of the evening when the shadows grow long and the air begins to bite. The timing is crucial. The ground is soft under your worn shoes, and the air is heavy and cool with moisture from a recent rain. This is the perfect atmosphere, the prime time for our slow-moving quarry to be out and about. You leave the cramped, smoky hut or the orderly stone cloister behind and head for the woods. As you step under the canopy of the trees, the world changes. The sounds of the village or monastery fade, replaced by the gentle percussion of water dripping from a billion leaves. The light is dim, filtered through a high ceiling of green and gold. Everything is rendered in shades of brown, gray, and a deep, vibrant, mossy green. The forest floor is a soft, thick carpet of decaying leaves, fallen branches, and rich, dark soil. It smells of wet earth, of mushrooms, of the slow and patient recycling of life itself. This is the snail's kingdom. Your task now is one of quiet observation. This is the opposite of fast food. It is patient food. The main ingredient has one speed, and you have little choice but to adopt it. You move slowly, your eyes scanning not the path ahead, but the world at your feet. You are not looking for movement. A snail's progress is too stately to catch the eye. You are looking for a shape, a pattern. The perfect, gentle spiral of a shell set against the chaotic, random textures of the forest. It's a medieval game of Where's Waldo, but the prize is dinner, and Waldo is, edible. You learn where to look. Not in the bright sunny clearings, but in the damp shaded places. You gently lift the broad, flat leaves of a patch of burdock. You run your hand over the cool, mossy flank of a fallen log, its wood soft with rot. You peer into the dark crevices of a dry stone wall that marks the edge of a long, abandoned field. You are training your senses to a different frequency, attuning them to the small, hidden lives of the forest floor. And there, tucked into a cushion of moss at the base of an old oak, its shell the color of wet bark and autumn leaves, is your first find. You reach down, your fingers brushing aside the damp moss. The shell is cool and solid, a perfect little piece of natural architecture. You pluck it gently. You might feel a moment of soft, suctioned resistance before it comes free. As you pick it up, it retreats into its shell, pulling its little door shut behind it. It's a futile gesture, but you have to admire the optimism. You drop it into your basket where it makes a soft, dry clack. That is the first note in the quiet symphony of a successful forage. This act of gathering was an absolutely essential part of medieval life. The meager harvest from your family, a small strip of land, was rarely enough to last the year. Foraging supplemented this diet, a practice protected by what were known as common rights. These rights often allowed even the poorest peasant to enter the Lord's forest to gather firewood, nuts, berries, mushrooms, and to hunt for small creatures like the snail. It was a vital safety net, a way of harvesting the wild pantry when the cultivated one was bare. You don't wander aimlessly. Over years of practice, you've developed a map in your head, a secret atlas of your local terrain. You know the specific hollow where the water pools after a storm, the north-facing side of a particular rocky outcrop that stays damp all day, the patch of wild garlic whose wide leaves provide the perfect shady cover. This is a deep, unwritten form of ecological knowledge, passed down not in books but through experience. A quiet expertise on the habits of the land and its smallest inhabitants. Historians still argue whether the act of foraging was seen as a grueling chore born of desperation, or if it also held a different cultural significance. Did it offer a measure of freedom? A quiet escape from the monotonous, back-breaking, and closely supervised labor of the fields? Out here under the trees, you are your own master. Your success depends only on your own skill and patience. There is a quiet dignity in that. One by one, the snails join the first in your basket. Clack. Clack. Another one, this time clinging to the underside of a fern. Another making its slow way up a stone. The basket grows heavier, its weight a comforting, tangible promise of a meal. You return as the light begins to fail, the basket cradled in your arm. The hunt is over. The harvest is done. Foraging like this is well and good for a peasant family. It can even supplement the stores of a small monastery. But for a large, organized community with 100 mouths to feed through a long Lent, relying on the whims of weather and the luck of the hunt is an inefficient, unreliable system. You need a supply that is predictable, consistent, and most importantly, right outside your kitchen door. To achieve that, you would have to move from patient hunting to patient farming. You would need to build a pen. Foraging is a gamble, a game of chance played against the weather and the seasons. For an institution like a monastery, an organized community that has to feed 100 men day in and day out, a gamble is not good enough. You need certainty. You need a system. And so you turn from the wild, unpredictable woods to the meticulously ordered space of the garden, bringing the mountain to Muhammad, so to speak. If the mountain moved at a pace of 1 yard per hour, you are standing now in the monastery's kitchen garden. It is a masterpiece of medieval organization, a testament to the Benedictine ideal of prayerful work. You see raised beds in neat straight rows filled with dark, rich soil. Leeks stand in disciplined ranks next to burgeoning cabbages, and the air is fragrant with the sharp scent of mint, the apple-like sweetness of chamomile, and the woody aroma of rosemary. And over in a shady corner against the cool, damp stone of the monastery's north wall is a low fenced enclosure. It doesn't look like much, but this is the monastery's ingenious solution to the Lenten protein problem. This is a humble snail farm. Historians still argue whether the practice of medieval snail farming was a continuous, albeit diminished tradition handed down from the Romans, or if it was independently reinvented by clever monks facing the exact same problem of creating a controlled, reliable food supply. Whatever its origin, the design is one of practical simplicity. A low, wattle fence, perhaps only a foot high, marks the perimeter. Inside the fence, a shallow trench has been dug and is kept filled with water, a tiny moat that the snails cannot cross. Sometimes, instead of a moat, a thick line of wood ash from the kitchens is poured along the base of the fence, a dry, powdery barrier that the moist creatures will refuse to traverse. Inside the pen is a snail's paradise. The ground is kept damp and shady. Flat stones and old roof tiles are scattered about, providing cool, dark places for the inhabitants to hide from the heat of the day. The enclosure itself has been planted with their favorite foods, broad-leafed lettuces and cabbages, their outer leaves left to grow wild for the purpose. It's a 5-star resort for gastropods, complete with an all-you-can-eat buffet and ample private lodging. It was the perfect livestock for a contemplative order. The snails required minimal supervision and were unlikely to stage a noisy or particularly fast-moving escape. This kind of small-scale animal husbandry was a hallmark of monastic life. Monasteries were the great agricultural research centers of the Middle Ages. The monks managed vast farms, practiced crop rotation, and built complex food systems to ensure their self-sufficiency. Just as they engineered large ponds, or piscinae, to raise carp and tench for their Friday meals, they managed this small enclosure to raise their snails. The pen is first stocked with large, healthy specimens gathered from the wild. Once established, the colony sustains itself. You see a lay brother walk over to the enclosure. He doesn't carry the wine-soaked spelt mash of a Roman snail epicure. These are holy snails, living a life of simple austerity. The brother tosses in a handful of wilted outer leaves from the cabbages destined for the refectory table. along with a scoop of bran from the bakehouse. The snails are essentially a tiny shelled recycling program, efficiently converting garden waste into a permissible Lenten protein. You might also notice a fine white powder sprinkled over parts of the soil. It's crushed eggshells from the kitchen, or perhaps limestone grit. The monks learned, through careful observation, that the snails needed calcium to build strong, healthy shells, a surprisingly sophisticated piece of animal husbandry. With this system in place, the harvest is transformed. There is no more need for a long, damp walk in the woods, no more uncertainty. When the kitchen needs snails, a brother simply walks to the pen, lifts a few of the stones, and gathers what is required. Harvesting was now less of a noble hunt and more like picking apples from a very, very slow-moving tree. You stand by the enclosure for a moment, watching the snails in their contained, predictable world. They move with that same placid grace as their wild cousins, but their fate is far more certain. The problem of supply, the great challenge of finding enough snails, has been solved with typical monastic ingenuity. But this victory only brings you to the door of the next, and perhaps most crucial, stage of the process. You cannot take a snail straight from this earthly paradise and toss it in the soup pot. It is full of, well, it's full of whatever it last ate. It is full of garden. Before it can become food for men, it must first be cleansed, inside and out. It must be purged. You have your snails, a basket full of them, plump from the managed luxury of the monastery pen or freshly gathered from the damp forest floor. Their shells make that soft, clacking sound as you carry them towards the kitchens. A novice might assume the next step is to simply put them in the pot, but you know better. Your work is far from over. In many ways, the most delicate and defining part of the entire operation is about to begin. You cannot rush this stage. This is the purge. A snail, you see, is a living record of its last few meals. Its digestive tract is full of whatever it has been grazing on for the past day or so. If it was in the wild, it might have been dining on a bitter weed, or a leaf that is perfectly harmless to a snail but mildly toxic to a human. And there is, of course, the unavoidable and gritty issue of dirt. To cook and eat a snail straight from the garden would be to eat the garden itself in its rawest, most unappetizing form. So before the snail can become food, its inner world must be completely emptied and reset. This stage is essentially a snail detox spa. They check in, get a private room, and are put on a strict diet. It's all very exclusive, and the final checkout is a real killer. You take a large unglazed clay pot, one with small holes pierced in the lid to allow air to circulate, or perhaps you use a simple wooden box with a heavy stone placed on top. The container must be breathable but, crucially, secure. You gently place the snails inside and fasten the lid. And now, the snails wait. For the next several days, sometimes for as long as a week, they are left in the cool darkness with no food at all. This is the Great Fast. During this time, their bodies slowly process and excrete everything that was left in their systems. This is a vital, if not particularly glamorous, part of the process. Each day you must open the container, remove the snails, thoroughly clean out the pot, and then place them back inside. This daily cleaning is essential. It prevents the snails from undoing all your hard work by simply eating what they and their neighbors have already excreted. Table manners were, apparently, not a snail's strong suit. After several days of fasting, the first stage is complete. Their systems are empty. But now they are weak, and their flesh, while clean, is not at its best. So they enter the second phase of their spa treatment, the finishing diet. The goal now is to refill their tiny bodies with something clean, simple, and wholesome. You might give them a light dusting of wheat flour or oat bran. The snails will slowly consume this, and their flesh will become plump and pale. You are what you eat, and the goal was to make these snails taste less like random forest floor and more like a hint of thyme. Sometimes specific herbs like fennel, parsley, or thyme were given to the snails in this final stage, with the belief that it would delicately perfume their meat from the inside out. This practice of purging is not a medieval invention. It is an ancient and absolutely essential step in preparing snails for consumption, a piece of culinary wisdom that has remained unchanged for millennia. The Roman gourmand Apicius described the process and it is still a non-negotiable step in the preparation of modern escargot. But how did you know for sure when the process was complete? A common and clever folk method was to perform a simple quality control test. You would take one snail from the pot and place it on a clean white surface, like a ceramic plate or a floured wooden board, and let it move. If the slime trail it left behind was perfectly clean and clear, it was ready. If the trail was dark, green, or gritty, the whole batch needed more time to cleanse. Historians still argue whether the specific length of the purging period and the types of finishing foods used were standardized across Europe, or if they varied dramatically based on regional tradition, the specific species of snail being used, and even the season in which they were harvested. A snail fattened on summer greens might require a longer purge than one gathered in the relative scarcity of autumn. It was a local art, a form of kitchen science based on generations of trial and error. Finally, after a week or more of patient, daily work, you have your result. You lift the lid from the pot. Inside are clean, quiet snails. They are no longer full of the wild grit of the world, but are now a neutral, pristine ingredient. They have become a blank canvas, ready to absorb the flavors of the soup that awaits them. They have been hunted or farmed, and now they have been cleansed. All the preliminary rituals are complete. Now, and only now, can you truly begin to cook. You take the pot to the hearth, where a heavy iron cauldron of water is already beginning to warm over the gentle licking flames. The first, most basic layer of flavor is about to be created. The hearth is the heart of your home, its low, smoky fire, a small domestic sun warding off the persistent damp and the encroaching darkness. You kneel before it on the packed earth floor, your pot of cleansed snails ready at your side. The days of patient preparation are over. The time for the actual cooking, for the alchemy of turning these humble ingredients into a meal, has finally begun. You are making the most basic elemental version of this dish, a peasant's snail soup. First, a crucial preliminary step, a ritual of purification by water. You tip the purged snails into the heavy iron cauldron, which is already hanging over the flames and filled with boiling water. They simmer for just a few minutes in this first bath. This quick boil serves two purposes. It cooks the small morsel of meat inside the shell, and just as importantly, it helps to remove the last of the inherent slime, which, if left in, could give the final soup a thick, slightly gummy texture. After a few minutes, you carefully tip the cauldron, draining this cloudy, frothy water away onto the dirt floor. It has served its purpose, washing away the last memory of the snail's raw, wild nature. Now you begin again. You refill the cauldron with fresh, cool water from the wooden bucket you hauled from the village well this morning. This water is the canvas. It holds the promise of a meal. As it begins to warm, you reach for the other ingredients, which sit in a small, wilted pile next to the hearth. There are no plump, cultivated onions here. No perfect carrots or celery from a manicured garden. Your pantry is the forest floor and the overgrown hedgerow. You take a handful of broad, deep green leaves and drop them into the pot. These are ramsons, or wild garlic, and their pungent, oniony scent immediately begins to rise with the steam. Next, you add a bundle of young nettle tops, a plant that fights back. You learned long ago to harvest it with care, gripping the stalk firmly to avoid the tiny stinging hairs. Once they hit the hot water, their sting vanishes completely, and they wilt into a soft, dark green mass that will lend the soup an earthy flavor, much like spinach and a dose of much-needed vitamins. Many of the plants we now call weeds were, for you, a welcome and nutritious part of the daily diet. Things like ground elder, dandelions, and chickweed were all simply pottage herbs, deliberately foraged and added to the ever-simmering pot. This is the essence of your cooking. This snail soup is not some standalone special occasion dish. It is a variation on the theme that dominates your culinary world: pottage. That thick grain and vegetable stew was the cornerstone of the medieval peasant diet. A dish that was never truly finished, but was constantly topped up with new water and whatever ingredients the day provided. Your snail soup is simply the pottage of the day, made special by its star ingredient. You add the parboiled snails back to the pot, along with a sprig of wild thyme you found growing on a sunny bank. You stir it all with a long, smoke-blackened wooden spoon. There is no written recipe, no timer. You cook by sight, by smell, by instinct, and by the inherited memory of how your mother did it before you. This isn't a soup that's ready in 30 minutes. This is a soup that's ready when it's ready. Its main ingredients are water, leaves, snails, and the slow, inexorable passage of time. As the soup simmers, historians still argue whether you would have painstakingly removed each snail from its shell at this point, or if they were simply left in to be picked out by hand as the soup was eaten. Leaving them in was certainly easier, turning the meal into a more interactive communal affair. Taking them out would have created a smoother, more uniform dish, but it was a tedious, time-consuming task. The choice likely came down to local custom, or simply how much time and patience you had on any given day. The hut slowly fills with a simple, savory aroma. It is not a complex perfume, but it is the smell of food, the smell of sustenance. You dip your spoon in and taste. The flavor is earthy, green, and deeply savory, with the mild, almost mushroom-like taste of the snails themselves floating through the pungent notes of wild garlic. This is the original clean eating. No preservatives, no additives, no complicated flavors. It tasted of the earth because it was, for the most part, harvested directly from it. You stir the cauldron again. It is a good soup. It is hot, nourishing, and has a gentle, wild flavor. But it is thin. The broth, for all its taste, is watery. It will warm you, but it won't fill you in the way a truly hearty meal should. To turn this simple broth into something that will stick to your ribs and fuel a long day of labor in the fields, it needs body. It needs substance. It needs a thickener. The flavor is there, dancing on your tongue, a wild, green, earthy taste. But the substance is missing. The soup is a ghost, a soul without a body. And in your world, a meal is judged not by its elegance of flavor, but by its brute ability to silence a rumbling stomach and fuel a body for hours of hard labor. This thin broth simply will not do, so you turn from the hearth and survey your limited larder for the tools of transformation, the humble ingredients that will give this soup its necessary heartiness. Your eyes land on the corner of the rough-hewn table, where a small, dark loaf of bread sits. It's a few days old, made from barley or rye, and it has the dense, unyielding consistency of a wooden plank. To a modern palate, it might seem inedible, but to you it is a valuable culinary asset. Wasting bread in your world was an unthinkable sin. Every crumb was precious. Today we might call it croutons or artisanal breadcrumbs and pay a fortune for it. You just called it Wednesday. This stale bread is your primary weapon in the war against watery soup. You take the loaf, which is too hard to cut, and break off a large hunk with your hands. You crumble it into rough, jagged pieces and drop them directly into the bubbling cauldron. At first, they just bob on the surface like little brown islands. But slowly, the hot liquid begins to work its magic. The hard crusts soften. The dense crumb soaks up the savory broth like a sponge. As you stir, the pieces begin to break down, dissolving into the soup, melting away and releasing their starches until they are no longer chunks of bread, but an integral part of the liquid itself. This is the oldest trick in the book. In fact, the very word soup that we use today is a direct descendant of the word Aesop, which was the piece of bread used to soak up broth. In thickening your snail pottage with stale bread, you are not just making a meal. You are participating in the very creation of soup itself. But bread alone might not be enough, especially if the loaf is small. You rise and walk to a small wooden chest where your meager stores are kept. You reach into a rough linen sack and pull out a handful of grain. Perhaps it's barley, whose pearly grains will remain slightly chewy, adding a pleasant texture. Or maybe it's coarse milled oats, which will break down almost completely, lending the whole pot a creamy, porridge-like consistency. You toss the handful into the cauldron. The grains slowly sink into the bubbling liquid, each one a tiny agent of transformation. The goal was a soup thick enough that a spoon could stand up in it if only for a moment. This was the medieval metric for a truly successful, life-sustaining meal. No wimpy broths were allowed in this house. This wasn't just a peasant's trick. The technique of thickening with bread and grains was universal in medieval kitchens. Specific types of stews, known as bruets or civies, were almost always finished with bread, which was sometimes toasted over the fire first to add a deeper, smokier flavor. Historians still argue whether the constant addition of bread and grain to the communal pot was a deliberate culinary technique aimed at creating a specific, thick texture. or if it was simply a practical, non-negotiable method of preserving leftovers and ensuring that not a single calorie of food was ever wasted. In truth, it was a perfect marriage of the two, a technique born from the soul of frugality that became the defining characteristic of the era's cuisine. You give the pot one last slow stir with your long wooden spoon. The spoon feels heavy now, dragging through the liquid with a satisfying resistance. The soup has been completely transformed. It is no longer a clear, thin broth, but a thick, opaque, and hearty pottage. Lumps of softened bread, swollen grains, wilted wild greens, and the occasional tender snail are all suspended in the thick, savory gruel. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. It was a thick, grayish, lumpy substance in a pot. But it was hot, it was filling, and it would keep you and your family going through the next day's toil. In your world, that made it a masterpiece. This is the snail soup of the common person, the meal of the vast majority. But as you eat your simple, earthy pottage by the firelight, you can imagine a different scene. In the stone manors and drafty castles of the wealthy, a very different kind of snail soup was simmering over a much larger fire. A soup made not just with water and foraged weeds, but with rich broths, with wine, and with the dazzling, almost magical power of expensive imported spices. A soup designed not just for sustenance, but for status. Let's leave the smoky peasant's hut behind. Push aside the rough, greasy woolen flap of the doorway and step out into the cool, dark night. As your eyes adjust, you look up the hill towards the great stone manor house, its few glass windows glowing like orange eyes in the darkness. We are not approaching the grand front entrance. We are heading around the back, drawn by the noise, the heat, and the incredible smells coming from the kitchens. You step into a room that is the complete opposite of the peasant's quiet, solitary hearth. This is a vast, cavernous space with a soot-blackened ceiling so high it's lost in shadow. Several fires roar in huge stone fireplaces, where whole animals are roasting on spits. The air is thick with heat, steam, and 100 competing smells. It's a chaotic, sweltering hub of activity, a culinary workshop staffed by a whole team of cooks in stained aprons, shouting orders over the clang of pots and the rhythmic thud of chopping knives. Over on a long wooden table, a cook is directing the preparation of the evening's first course, and the main ingredient is familiar, a large bowl of purged, cleaned snails. But here, the similarities to the humble soup of the fields come to an abrupt end. The cook turns to a small iron-bound wooden box that sits on a high shelf. He unlocks it with a key that he keeps on a chain around his neck. This small locked box is the heart of the noble kitchen. It is the spice chest, and it is worth more than the horse you rode in on, and quite possibly the servant who is now carefully grinding its contents. Inside are the treasures of the East, substances that have traveled thousands of miles over land and sea to reach this kitchen. There are the gnarled, pale roots of ginger and the tiny, hard peppercorns that provide a searing, pleasant heat. There are sticks of cinnamon, dried cloves that look like tiny nails, and the precious, fragrant nutmeg. And in a small, tightly sealed pouch, the most valuable of all, the delicate thread-like red strands of saffron. In the Middle Ages, spices were the ultimate status symbol. Their trade was a source of immense wealth, particularly for the merchants of Venice and Genoa, and their use was a clear and unambiguous declaration of your riches. To use spice was to literally consume your wealth. The cook begins. The base for this soup is not plain water from a well. It is a rich, flavorful chicken broth that has been simmering for hours with herbs from the castle's cultivated garden. To this he might add a splash of verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, to give it a bright, acidic lift. The thickener is not stale, dark rye bread. It is a handful of fine white breadcrumbs made from the Lord's own manchet bread, or even a cup of finely ground almonds which will produce a soup that is pale creamy and impossibly smooth, the very opposite of the peasant's lumpy pottage. Now for the magic. The cook takes a tiny, careful pinch of the red saffron threads and drops them into the simmering pot. Almost instantly, the pale broth begins to transform, taking on a brilliant, glorious, golden yellow hue. In noble medieval cuisine, color was king. A great feast was a visual spectacle, and a dish that was brown or gray was considered dull and common. The goal wasn't just to make the soup taste good, it was to make it look like liquid gold. Because nothing says, "I'm richer than you," quite like eating a bowl of sunshine. Next, the servant brings the freshly ground spices in a small bowl. The cook adds a spoonful of the ginger and pepper. Historians still argue whether the famously heavy use of spices in medieval times was a desperate attempt to mask the taste of poorly preserved meat. But most now believe it was purely a matter of conspicuous consumption and a genuine preference for the bold, complex flavors that were so different from the local tastes of the European countryside. The final soup is ladled into a fine, glazed ceramic bowl. It is a vibrant, shining gold. It smells intoxicatingly of ginger and saffron, a warm, exotic perfume that speaks of distant, sun-drenched lands. You can see the pale shapes of the snails suspended in the creamy, thick liquid, waiting to be eaten with a fine silver spoon. This wasn't the humble, muddy soup of the fields. This was a statement. It was a culinary symphony where the snail was merely the first violin, not the entire orchestra. But this dish is more than just a rich man's version of a poor man's meal. It is a carefully engineered product. Every ingredient, the snails, the almonds, the wine, the hot spices, has been chosen for a reason that goes beyond pure taste. It has been chosen to create a dish that is perfectly balanced, not just in flavor, but in its very essence, according to the complex medical theories that governed every aspect of a wealthy person's life. That beautiful, fragrant golden soup sitting in a bowl on the high table of the manor hall is more than a meal. It is more than a status symbol. It is, in its own way, a prescription. To truly understand its construction, you have to understand the very intellectual air that medieval people breathed. The grand unifying theory that explained everything from a common cold to the nature of the entire universe. You have to understand the doctrine of the four humors. This idea, inherited from the ancient Greek physicians Hippocrates and Galen, was the undisputed bedrock of Western medicine for over 1,500 years. It proposed that the human body was composed of four primary liquids or humors: blood, which was naturally hot and moist; phlegm, which was cold and moist; yellow bile, which was hot and dry; and black bile, which was cold and dry. A healthy person had all four of these humors in perfect, harmonious balance. Sickness, therefore, was simply a state of imbalance. Too much of one humor, not enough of another. A fever was an excess of heat. A chesty, phlegmy cough was an excess of cold and moisture. And the primary way you maintained your balance or corrected an imbalance was through your diet. Every single food, every drink, every herb and spice was meticulously categorized by its own inherent humoral properties. Was it hot or cold in its nature? Was it moist or dry? The goal of a truly sophisticated cook, the master of a great kitchen, was not just to make food that tasted good. Their far more important job was to create dishes that were perfectly balanced, or that were specifically designed to counteract a known imbalance in the person eating them. This wasn't just cooking, it was a complex algebraic equation where snail plus ginger equals a healthy and productive Tuesday. Get the equation wrong, and you might accidentally make your lord sluggish, irritable, or tragically melancholic. Now let us apply this lens to our snail soup. First, the main ingredient. The snail. It is a creature of the damp, cool earth. It is slimy. It is slow. In the humoral system, the snail is the very definition of cold and moist. It is a dangerously phlegmatic food. To eat a large bowl of plain boiled snails would be to invite an excess of phlegm into your system, risking sluggishness, digestive trouble, and a general slide into ill health. So the noble cook's job is to counteract this inherent imbalance. They are not just adding spices for flavor, they are prescribing an antidote. The ginger and the black pepper are the medicinal heroes of this dish. Both were considered powerfully hot and dry. They are the perfect opposite of the snail, their fiery nature neutralizing its cold dampness. The splash of wine or verjuice is also considered warming and drying. The saffron, prized for its color, was also classified as moderately hot and dry, adding another layer of corrective warmth. Even the choice of thickener, ground almonds instead of oats, was deliberate, as almonds were considered to be moderately warm and moist, a much more balanced food than the colder grains. The head cook was basically the house doctor, but with a better hat and a much higher risk of getting yelled at if the soup was both unbalanced and bland. The wealthy even had beautifully illustrated guidebooks for this, health manuals known as Taquina Sanitatis. These books were like luxurious catalogs of well-being with pictures of people farming, foraging, and eating, and detailed descriptions of the humoral properties of every food and activity, advising on what to eat in which season to maintain perfect health. Historians still argue whether the average person on the street had any deep understanding of this complex humoral theory, or if it was an elite science largely confined to university-trained physicians and the highly educated cooks of noble and royal households. For the peasant, adding wild garlic to his pottage was a matter of taste and tradition. For the Lord's cook, adding ginger was a calculated medical intervention. This worldview was all-encompassing. Everything had a humoral value. Even activities. Taking a hot bath was moistening. Reading too many books could dry out your brain. A pleasant walk in the spring air was considered beneficial because it was moderately moistening. It's a wonder anyone left the house without a detailed itinerary and a corrective snack for balance. This complex system of balance was the universal law of health for the educated and the wealthy. But even within this grand, accepted system, there were unique and brilliant individuals who looked at nature and saw even deeper patterns and more specific meanings. One of the most remarkable of these minds belonged to a German abbess, a visionary, a composer, a writer, and a naturalist who had some very specific and occasionally very strange ideas about the healing power of all of God's creation, including the humble snail. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen. A 12th century German Benedictine abbess, she was a true force of nature, a polymath whose intellect and spirit seemed to know no bounds. She was a composer of soaring ethereal music, a writer of profound theological texts, an advisor to popes and emperors, and a visionary who claimed her knowledge came directly from God in shimmering visions of light. And, relevant to our journey tonight, she was a keen naturalist and the author of detailed books on medicine, most famously, her Physica. For Hildegard, the world of medicine was not just a mechanical system of balancing humors. It was infused with a spiritual, life-giving energy that she called viriditas, a concept that translates roughly to greening power or verdure. This was the divine vitality of God made manifest in the natural world, the force that made plants grow, healed wounds, and sustained life. To be healthy was to be full of viriditas. Her approach to healing, therefore, was about using the viriditas of specific plants and animals to restore the life force within a person. Historians still argue whether Hildegard's astonishingly detailed medical knowledge was based on her famous divine visions as she claimed, or if it was a brilliant synthesis of traditional German folk medicine, classical texts available in her monastery's library, and her own keen empirical observations of the world around her. Whatever the source, when Hildegard turned her formidable attention to the humble snail, she was not impressed. Where other monks saw a clever Lenten loophole, Hildegard saw a creature of profound impurity. She associated its slowness with sloth, and its cold, wet slime with the unhealthy foam and decay of the world. She wrote that snails grow from the slime and the dew of the earth, and that their nature was contrary to the health of man. In her view, eating them unprepared, as one might in a simple soup, was a risky proposition that could lead to fever and corrupt the humors. So, what do you do with such a problematic, spiritually suspect creature? According to Hildegard, you don't just gently balance it with a few hot spices. You must utterly and completely transform its very nature through a purifying trial by fire. She wasn't interested in making a snail soup. She was performing a kind of gastropod exorcism, driving out the bad qualities with fire and sacred herbs. Her prescription, as laid out in her writings, is startlingly specific. You are not to boil the snails. Instead, you take the living, purged snails and put them in a hot, dry pan with no water or fat. You roast them over the fire until all their moisture has evaporated, and they are so dry and brittle that they can be easily crushed into a fine powder. This act of roasting, an application of pure heat and dryness, fundamentally alters the snail's essence, destroying its harmful cold and moist properties. But the process isn't finished. You then take this snail dust and mix it with an equal amount of finely ground fennel seed, a warm herb known to aid digestion, and a smaller amount of another herb like water batoni. This potent dry powder is the final medicine, and it was not to be served as a soup, but sprinkled on bread and eaten as a cure for ailments described as pain in the spleen or troubles in the stomach. So while a French lord was delicately spooning a creamy, golden-balanced soup, Hildegard's patient was, in essence, eating medicinal snail dust on toast. One imagines it had a certain crunch. This unique remedy fits perfectly within Hildegard's broader medical system, which was full of highly specific and unique cures. It seems her divine visions provided not only soaring, beautiful music, but also some extremely specific and slightly strange dietary advice. She wrote that holding a warmed jasper stone to the ear could cure deafness, or that a person with cloudy vision should lick a sapphire and then touch the wet gem to their eyeball. The snail powder was another tool in this unique, spiritually infused apothecary. Here we have a completely different path in the snail's long culinary and medicinal journey. It is not a Lenten food, not a peasant's pottage, not a balanced, noble soup. Here, in the visionary world of Hildegard of Bingen, the snail is a problematic substance that must be ritually purified and transformed into a dry, powdered medicine. This uniquely German, intensely medicinal approach shows just how much variation there could be in the medieval world. The way a snail was prepared and understood in a convent on the misty Rhine was worlds away from how it might be seen in a bustling Italian city-state where the sun was hotter, the olive oil flowed freely, and the ghost of the Roman Empire still lingered in the kitchens. Let us leave the misty Rhine valley and the world of Hildegard's medicinal dust behind. We travel south now, in our minds, over the great, cold spine of the Alps, the wind whistling through the high passes. And then we descend, down into the sun-warmed hills and fertile plains of medieval Italy. Immediately the world feels different. The air is warmer, drier, scented with cypress and thyme. The light is sharper, the shadows darker. And the food changes completely. You've crossed the Alps, and your taste buds have woken up. The food of the north, with its reliance on boiling and stewing in water or thin broths, suddenly seems muted and shy. Here the food is no longer whispering apologetically about itself. It is singing opera. You are in a Tuscan farmhouse kitchen. A fire roars in a large hearth, and on it a wide, shallow terracotta pot is warming. We are here to see how the Italians make their zuppa di lumache, their snail soup, and the process begins with a sound and a smell utterly foreign to the northern peasant hut. The sizzle of garlic in a pool of hot olive oil. This is the great culinary dividing line of medieval Europe. North of the Alps, the cooking fats were animal-based. Butter in the rich pasture lands, lard rendered from pigs everywhere else. But here, south of the Alps, life is lubricated by the fruit of the olive tree. The cook begins not with water but with a generous glug of greenish gold, peppery olive oil, a foundational flavor that will permeate the entire dish. Into this she adds a roughly chopped onion and several cloves of garlic. The recipe might call for a clove or two, but the Italian cook understands this to mean a whole head. Garlic here is less of an ingredient and more of a co-star. The kitchen immediately fills with that intoxicating savory perfume as the aromatics soften in the hot oil. Here in Italy, the memory of the Roman Empire is not a distant scholarly legend. It is written in the stones of the crumbling aqueducts, in the ruins of the amphitheaters, and it lingers in the pantry. Historians still argue whether the pronounced Italian taste for snails was a direct and unbroken continuation of Roman culinary habits, or if it was a parallel rediscovery like in the north that was simply shaped by the readily available Mediterranean ingredients. But as you watch the cook, it feels like a memory. The confidence, the robust flavors, it all echoes the ancient world. Once the onions and garlic are soft and fragrant, the cook adds a splash of rough red wine from a nearby jug. It hits the hot pot with a loud, satisfying hiss, the steam carrying the sharp, fruity aroma of the wine through the kitchen. She scrapes the bottom of the pot with a wooden spoon, lifting all the sweet, caramelized bits into the liquid. This is the flavor base. The herbs she adds are different too. Not the soft, damp nettles of a northern forest, but the tough, woody, and intensely fragrant sprigs of rosemary and sage. Herbs that thrive under the hot Mediterranean sun. Only now, into this already complex and fragrant base of flavor, are the purged snails added. They are stirred into the mixture, their pale flesh absorbing the tastes of the wine, the oil, and the herbs. A ladleful of water or a light broth is added, and the pot is covered and left to simmer, allowing the flavors to marry and the snails to become meltingly tender. In some regions, particularly further south or on the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, the recipe might include a pinch of wild fennel seed or even a sprig of mint, flavors that speak of an even more ancient, pre-Roman past. A thread of taste connecting this medieval kitchen to the Greek and Phoenician traders who once plied these seas. The final dish is ladled not into a delicate nobleman's bowl, but into a thick, rustic earthenware crock. The soup is a deep, rich, reddish-brown color from the wine and the slow cooking. The broth is not thickened with bread or grain, but is intensely flavorful, meant to be soaked up with a piece of crusty, hearth-baked bread. The taste is bold, almost primal. This isn't a soup that's trying to balance a difficult humor or hide its main ingredient in a golden sauce. This is a soup that is proudly, robustly, and unapologetically about snails, garlic, and olive oil. This sun-drenched, confident Italian approach is a world away from the medicinal dust of Germany or the thick survivalist pottage of the north. But what of the land that lies between these two culinary worlds? The kingdom that would one day, centuries from now, claim the snail as its own national delicacy. We now travel northwest, across the maritime Alps, into the green fields and damp forests of medieval France. We leave the sunny terracotta-tiled farmhouses of Italy behind and travel northwest, our imaginary journey taking us across the maritime Alps and into the green heartland of medieval France. The landscape softens. The light is gentler, filtered through the leaves of ancient oak and beech forests. The air smells of damp earth, of flowering meadows, and of cow pasture. This is a landscape of rolling fields, deep woods, and small, tightly clustered stone villages. A world that feels both ancient and deeply agricultural. You find yourself in the kitchen of a French peasant farmer. It's still a simple, one-room affair with a central hearth, but perhaps it feels a little more organized. Through the open doorway, you can see a small, well-tended kitchen garden, a potager, with neat rows of herbs and vegetables. Welcome to France, where even the peasant's soup has a certain je ne sais quoi. It's still made with humble, local ingredients, but there's a subtle shift in the approach. A whisper of the culinary refinement that will one day define this nation's cuisine. The French cook begins with fat, but it is not the green-gold river of olive oil you saw in Italy. Here in the north of France, we are back in the kingdom of animal fat. The soup begins with a small knob of precious salty butter, churned from the milk of the family's own cow, or more likely a spoonful of glistening bacon fat, carefully saved from a holiday feast. This fat is melted down in the iron cauldron, and its rich, savory smell immediately sets a different tone. Into the hot fat go the aromatics. Not the pungent wild garlic of the English woods or the operatic quantities of Italian garlic, but the leek. The humble, hardy leek, easily grown in a kitchen garden, is the star here. It provides a sweeter, milder, more subtle, oniony flavor. The leek is the onion's more sophisticated, gentler cousin. It doesn't make you cry as much, which is a real bonus when your life is already a medieval struggle for survival. The leeks are cooked slowly, softened in the fat until they are sweet and melting. Once the leeks are ready, the purged snails are added to the pot and stirred for a moment, coating them in the flavorful fat. Then comes the liquid, mostly water, but perhaps with a small splash of the local rough wine or the familiar acidic verjuice to brighten the taste. A bundle of wild thyme, or serpelet, gathered from a sunny hillside, is dropped in. Its tiny leaves release a warm, peppery, and intensely aromatic perfume that is the very essence of the French countryside. This comfort with the snail as a food source runs deep here. In regions like Burgundy, a place now world famous for its snail dishes, the large and plump Roman snail, Helix pomatia, thrived in the limestone-rich soils of the vineyards. The history of eating them here is ancient and unbroken. In some French villages, the first big snail harvest of the season was a communal event, a kind of snail fast or June, where the whole community would go out to gather them, culminating in a shared village feast. You watch the pot simmer gently over the fire. This soup is the distant, humble ancestor of the modern, world-famous dish, Escargot de Bourgogne. But there is no garlic parsley butter here, no special platter with little divots, no tiny forks or strange tongs. This is escargot before it got all dressed up and started charging a fortune to be eaten in a fancy restaurant. This is escargot in its comfortable rustic sweatpants. Historians still argue whether the modern French obsession with escargot is a direct, unbroken continuation of this widespread peasant tradition, or if it was a later 19th century culinary invention by Parisian chefs who took a humble, rustic food and elevated it to the status of a gourmet delicacy. Looking at this simple, fragrant soup, the truth seems to be a bit of both. The tradition was always there, waiting for the right chef to give it a new set of clothes. The resulting soup is different again from all the others. The broth is richer, more savory from the bacon fat or butter. It has the sweet, gentle flavor of the leeks and the unmistakable woody scent of wild thyme. The snail is still the hero, but it's floating in a softer, more aromatic and deeply comforting broth. This rustic French fare shows a deep and abiding comfort with the snail as food. But this comfort, this tradition, can be stopped by something as simple as a stretch of water. We now prepare to cross the choppy, gray, and often perilous waters of the English Channel, to a land where the attitude towards eating a common garden pest was decidedly more complicated. We leave the shores of France behind, the scent of thyme and leeks fading on the sea breeze. Our journey now takes us across the choppy, gray, and unforgiving waters of the English Channel. As the white cliffs of Dover rise through the mist, the world changes once more. The air feels heavier, saturated with a dampness that sinks into your bones. You have arrived in medieval England, a land of deep, dark forests, misty moors, and a culinary mindset that is, once again, entirely its own. It's a country that looked at a snail and thought not dinner, but you. If the French peasant felt a comfortable, rustic familiarity with the snail, and the Italian farmer a robust ancestral connection, the average English person's attitude was one of cautious curiosity at best, and outright suspicion at worst. Here, the snail was not a common ingredient, not a Lenten staple, not a foraged treat. It was, first and foremost, a pest, a slimy marauder that devoured the cabbages in your garden, a creature of the damp and the dark to be scraped off walls and tossed aside. The Roman culinary influence, which had never fully vanished from Italy and lingered in the vineyards of Burgundy, seemed to have evaporated almost completely in Britain after the legions departed. The Anglo-Saxons who came to dominate the island had their own robust food traditions, a diet built on roasted meats, thick ales, hard cheeses, and bread. It was a hearty, straightforward cuisine, not known for its subtlety or its embrace of unusual ingredients. Basically a medieval pub lunch minus the crisps. Snails simply weren't on the menu. Because of this, snails in England were relegated to the very bottom of the food chain, becoming a food of last resort. They were famine food. In the lean months of late winter, or in years when the harvest failed, a starving peasant might be driven to gather and eat snails from the woods to survive. But it was an act of desperation, not tradition. It was a sign that things had gone terribly, terribly wrong. This is backed up by the historical record. Archaeological evidence for widespread snail consumption in medieval English settlements is significantly scarcer than in comparable sites across the Channel in France. The piles of discarded shells just aren't there. So where the snail did appear, it was often in a very different context. Medicine. The folk beliefs about snail slime healing burns or warts were present here, just as they were on the continent. But English medical texts sometimes took it a step further, into realms of the truly bizarre. In the 16th century, the respected physician John Caius wrote a recipe intended to treat patients suffering from consumption or tuberculosis. His prescription was a stew made from snails, herbs, and a pint of earthworms. Stewed snails and earthworms. A dish that really says I have literally nothing else to lose. It's a bold culinary statement, if that statement is, please, just let this end. This frames the snail not as a desirable food, but as a key ingredient in a strange and desperate magical cure. Historians still argue whether this English aversion to snails was a matter of deep-seated cultural taste, a legacy of the Anglo-Saxon palate, or if it was related to the local snail species being considered smaller or less palatable than their large, plump continental cousins. Whatever the reason, the slimy gastropod was firmly categorized as foreign. And that brings us to the great exception, the Norman French aristocracy. After William the Conqueror's invasion in 1066, England was ruled by a French-speaking elite. These nobles, knights, and bishops brought their language, their architecture, and their palates with them. It is almost certain that in the great kitchens of the Tower of London or Windsor Castle, cooks were preparing snails in the French style for their masters, a taste of home in a damp and foreign land. This would have only reinforced the snail's alien status, marking it as a strange, luxurious affectation of the French rulers, something entirely separate from the lives and tastes of the English-speaking common folk. This complicated, hesitant relationship, seeing the snail as a pest, a famine food, a weird medicine, and a foreign delicacy all at the same time, reveals something important. The snail was more than just a potential meal. It was a symbol. It carried meanings of foreignness, of desperation, of the strange and the lowly. And this symbolic weight helps to explain the snail's next and perhaps most baffling appearance in medieval culture, an appearance that has nothing to do with soup or medicine, but everything to do with art, chivalry, and a very, very strange sense of humor. The complicated, layered perception of the snail, as food, pest, medicine, and foreign oddity, shows that this humble creature carried a surprising amount of symbolic weight. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in its culinary or medicinal history can prepare you for the snail's most bizarre and inexplicable role in the medieval world. To see it, we must leave the kitchen and the garden behind and enter the profound scholarly quiet of a monastery's scriptorium. The room is cool and dim, the only light coming from a high, arched window. The air smells of old vellum, beeswax, and the sharp, oaky scent of ink. The only sound is the rhythmic, whispery scratch of dozens of quills moving across parchment as monks patiently copy the Word of God. You are surrounded by the creation of illuminated manuscripts, precious, handwritten Bibles, psalters, and books of hours, objects of incredible value and deep piety. The main text is written in a neat, formal script. The pages are decorated with intricate borders and capital letters shimmering with real gold leaf. This is serious, holy work. But then, you look closer. You look into the margins of the page, the space outside the sacred text, and in this borderland, all bets are off. The artists, known as illuminators, filled these spaces with a wild, and often baffling, collection of doodles and drawings known as marginalia. Here you find a world of pure medieval imagination, rabbits playing trumpets, monkeys dressed as doctors examining a patient, a fox pretending to be a bishop preaching to a flock of chickens. It is a space for humor, satire, and sheer, joyful strangeness. And it is here that you find the great manuscript mystery. One of the most common, persistent, and utterly inexplicable images in the margins of these holy books is the scene of a fully armed knight engaged in mortal combat with a snail. It's an image that is as baffling as it is widespread. You see it again and again. A knight, decked out in chainmail or shining plate armor, holding a sword and a shield emblazoned with his coat of arms. He looks determined, terrified, or sometimes just deeply confused. And facing him, often depicted as absurdly large and menacing, is a common garden snail. Its eye stalks are extended, its shell is gleaming, and it seems poised for battle. Sometimes the knight is on horseback. Sometimes the knight is losing, recoiling in terror from the slimy beast. What on earth is going on? What did the snail do to deserve this? Did it slime the knight's favorite charger? Did it eat the heraldic roses from the castle garden? The manuscripts offer no clues. No one knows for sure, and medieval art historians have built entire careers arguing about what these snail battles actually mean. It's the medieval equivalent of a cat meme. It makes no logical sense, it's everywhere for about 200 years. And scholars 1,000 years from now will be writing very serious papers trying to understand it. Several theories have been proposed. One early idea was that the snail was a derogatory symbol for the Lombards, a group of people from northern Italy who were stereotyped as cowardly moneylenders. The snail, hiding in its armored shell, represented the unchivalrous Lombard, being bravely vanquished by a proper knight. Another, more theological theory suggests the snail represents the sin of sloth, one of the 7 deadlies. The good Christian knight is therefore shown literally fighting temptation in the margins of his prayer book. A third interpretation sees the snail as a symbol of the resurrection. A snail retreats into its shell, sealing it shut for the winter as if in a tomb, only to emerge seemingly reborn in the spring. In this reading, the knight fighting the snail could represent humanity's struggle against death itself, a battle that precedes the final triumph of resurrection. But the most popular theory today is much simpler. It was just a joke. The humor comes from the pure absurdity of the situation. You have the most powerful, heavily armed figure in medieval society, the knight, pitted against one of the slowest, most harmless, and least threatening creatures imaginable. It's a parody of the chivalric romances that were popular at the time, which were full of knights fighting fearsome dragons and giants. This was the artist poking fun at the genre, suggesting that sometimes the enemy you face isn't a fire-breathing monster, but a small, slimy problem right at your own feet. Perhaps it was just a monk, bored after 8 hours of meticulously copying scripture, who decided to draw the silliest and most unexpected thing he could think of. And for reasons we will never fully understand, it went viral, 13th century style. Whatever the true meaning, these strange and charming drawings proved that the snail was far more than just a menu item. It had crawled its way deep into the medieval imagination, becoming a creature loaded with contradictory meanings, a symbol of cowardice and sin, of resurrection and eternal life, and of the ridiculous, beautiful absurdity of the world itself. The image of a knight fighting a snail in the margins of a holy book leaves us with a profound sense of absurdity, but also with a question. How could one small, slow creature possibly contain enough meaning to justify such a strange and persistent obsession? The answer is that in the medieval mind, the snail wasn't just one thing. It was a creature of powerful and deeply contradictory symbols. We saw the hints of this in the last section, but now let us unpack the 2 most important and opposing meanings: the snail as a symbol of deadly sin, and the snail as a symbol of sacred resurrection. First, the more intuitive meaning, the snail as a symbol of sloth. To the medieval observer, the snail's most obvious characteristic is its slowness, its lack of vigorous action. It carries its house on its back, suggesting a creature unwilling to stray far from its own lazy comfort. This made it the perfect natural illustration for one of the 7 deadly sins: sloth, or as it was known in theological circles, acedia. This wasn't just about physical laziness or hitting the snooze button too many times. Acedia was a far more dangerous spiritual condition. It was a kind of existential weariness, an apathy of the soul that led to a person neglecting their spiritual duties. It was the feeling of being unable to get out of bed, not because you were tired, but because you had lost your sense of purpose and joy. The snail, in its slow, seemingly aimless crawling, became the unfortunate mascot for this grave spiritual illness. So when you see a knight fighting a snail, it can be read as a clear allegory. The noble Christian warrior doing battle with the temptation of spiritual laziness that threatens his very soul. But here is where the medieval mind takes a fascinating turn. This same creature, this poster child for a deadly sin, could also represent the single most important and holy event in all of Christianity. The snail was also a powerful symbol of the resurrection. This meaning comes not from its movement, but from its life cycle. As winter approaches or during a long drought, a garden snail will retreat deep into its shell. It then seals the entrance with a hard, calcified membrane called an epiphragm. To an observer, the snail appears to be dead, sealed within its own stony tomb. It can remain in this state of suspended animation for months. Then, when the spring rains come and the world turns green again, the snail breaks the seal, pushes its way out of the epiphragm, and emerges, seemingly reborn, back into the world of the living. For medieval theologians and artists, this was a miracle in miniature, a perfect, divinely written analogy for the death and resurrection of Christ. The shell was the tomb. The hard epiphragm was the stone rolled in front of the door, and the snail's reemergence in the spring was a quiet echo of the miracle of Easter morning. So the snail could be either a poster child for a deadly sin or a mascot for the resurrection. Talk about a flexible resume. This kind of dual symbolism was not unusual. The medieval world was understood through a complex web of allegory, codified in popular books called bestiaries. In these texts, a single animal could have multiple, often opposing meanings depending on the context. A lion, for example, could represent the noble and powerful Christ, the Lion of Judah, but it could also represent the devil, who, as the Bible says, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. The snail's journey from sinner to savior fits perfectly within this tradition. You might even find snails carved into the stonework of medieval churches, tucked away at the base of a pillar, a subtle reminder of either the sin to be fought or the salvation to be hoped for. Theologians and art historians still argue whether the primary symbolic meaning of the snail in any given context was determined by the artist, his personal intent, the specific wishes of the person paying for the book, or the expected interpretation of the educated monk or noble who would be reading it. This is why looking at medieval art can be so tricky. You think you're looking at a simple drawing of a snail, but you might be getting a whole sermon on sin, a lesson on the resurrection, and a veiled insult about Italian bankers all at once. So we have seen the snail in the soup pot, nourishing the body. We have seen it in the infirmary, healing the sick. And now we have seen it in the margins of the holiest texts, illustrating the struggles and the hopes of the human soul. But there was one more, surprisingly practical application for this versatile creature, one that had little to do with eating it or its deep symbolism, but everything to do with its most famous and curious product, its slime. We have followed the snail into the soup pot, the infirmary, and the very soul of the medieval artist. We have seen it as food, as medicine, and as a complex, contradictory symbol. But there was one more application for this surprisingly versatile creature, a use that had nothing to do with eating it, and everything to do with its most famous and curious byproduct. We are talking, of course, about the slime. Let's return for a moment to the doctrine of signatures, that beautifully simple idea that a thing's appearance reveals its purpose. We already saw how the snail's slime trail, which vanishes without a trace, was a signature for healing wounds without a scar. But a medieval woman, looking at her reflection in a polished bit of metal or a still pool of water, might have seen another possibility in that signature. A trail that leaves a surface smooth, glistening, and seemingly renewed. That sounds less like medicine for a wound and more like a treatment for the skin itself. And so, the humble snail slime found its place in the world of medieval skincare and folk cosmetics. This was the original 100% organic, cruelty-free, depending on your definition, single-ingredient skincare product. No parabens, no sulfates, just pure, unadulterated snail. The logic was direct. If the mucin could smooth over the rough surface of a stone, surely it could smooth the fine lines around one's eyes. If it provided a protective, moisturizing barrier for the snail's soft body, it could do the same for a human face. It was believed to soothe redness, soften weathered skin, and impart a youthful, dewy glow. The application would have been disarmingly simple. You might have kept a few snails in a clean, damp clay pot for this very purpose. In the evening, you would take one out and simply let it crawl across your face and hands. It required a certain amount of patience and a very high tolerance for having a snail slowly trekking across your forehead. Not a beauty routine for the particularly squeamish. You would then allow the glistening trail to dry on your skin, like a tightening, regenerative mask before rinsing it away. Alternatively, you could collect the mucin by gently agitating several snails in a bowl with a little water, creating a usable, if not particularly shelf-stable, lotion. While detailed cosmetic recipes from this period are rare, the use of snail slime for topical skin treatments is well documented in folk medicine traditions that stretch all the way back to antiquity. Pliny the Elder mentioned it. It was a known remedy for soothing minor burns from a sputtering hearth fire, or for calming the itch of a rash. For a peasant working long hours in the sun, a cool application of snail mucin would have been a welcome and completely free relief for sunburnt skin. In some folk traditions, the power of this remedy was even tied to the cycles of the moon. Applying the slime during a waxing moon was thought to be best for promoting healing, while the waning moon was better for shrinking away a wart. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether these cosmetic practices were widespread among the general population, or if they were niche folk remedies, passed down through families. Unlike pottery or tools, A skincare routine leaves no trace in the archaeological record, vanishing as completely as the slime trail itself. What is most remarkable, however, is that this specific piece of medieval folk wisdom has, in our own time, been enthusiastically rediscovered. The global beauty industry, particularly in South Korea, has embraced snail mucin as a so-called miracle ingredient. It is now the star component in countless expensive serums, creams, and masks, praised by scientists for its hydrating, antioxidant, and regenerative properties. So the next time you see a fancy, elegant bottle of snail repair cream on a brightly lit store shelf, you can smile, knowing that you're just paying a premium for a beauty secret your 13th century ancestor knew for free and practiced with a live snail on her face. We have now seen the snail from almost every angle: a source of food for the hungry, a medicine for the sick, a symbol for the soul, and a cosmetic for the skin. We understand why it was so important. It is time then to return to where we started, the soup. But this time our focus will not be on the ingredients or their meanings, but on the simple, essential physical objects that made it all possible. We have explored the snail as an ingredient, a medicine, and a symbol. We have traced its journey through different cultures and mindsets. It is time now to return to the most fundamental reality of the kitchen, to the place where all these ideas and ingredients are made real. We are going to look at the simple, timeless tools that turned a foraged creature into a life-sustaining meal. Our focus is no longer on the what or the why, but on the humble, physical how. Let us go back to the peasant's hut. Your kitchen is not so much a room as it is a designated patch of floor near the fire. There are no granite countertops here, no neat rows of cupboards. Your main countertop is your lap, or a smoothed, worn tree stump that serves as a stool. The center of your culinary world is the hearth. In the poorest homes, this is just a fire pit in the middle of the floor, its smoke curling upwards to find a smoke hole in the thatched roof. In a slightly more advanced setup, it is a stone-lined hearth built against a wall, but still crucially, without a chimney. The smoke billows out into the room, coating the rafters in a black, greasy layer of soot before eventually finding its way out. The constant wood smoke was great for slowly curing a side of bacon hung from the rafters, and for giving you a chronic hacking cough that was the signature soundtrack of the era. Suspended over this smoky, ever-glowing heart of the home is the single most important tool you own: the cauldron. This heavy, soot-blackened pot is your slow cooker, your stock pot, your soup kettle, and on laundry day, probably your washing machine. It is a true multi-purpose piece of technology. If you are fortunate, it is made of cast iron, a durable and valuable inheritance. If you are less well off, it might be made of bronze or even of thick, heavy earthenware. These clay pots were much cheaper, but had the unfortunate tendency to crack from the heat if you weren't careful. A small domestic disaster that could mean the loss of a precious meal. The cauldron hangs from a trammel hook, an adjustable iron chain or pole system that allows you to raise or lower it over the flames. This is your temperature control. Lowered down close to the licking flames, the contents will come to a rolling boil. Raised high above, into the smoky air where only the heat shimmers, the pot will maintain a slow, gentle simmer for hours on end. And it is here, in this state of perpetual slow cooking, that the pottage, the snail soup, lives its life. Your other tools are few and simple. You have a long-handled wooden spoon, its bowl worn and scarred from years of scraping the bottom of the pot. You have a simple, all-purpose knife with a handle of wood or bone, used for everything from slicing a hunk of bread to roughly chopping the wild garlic for the soup. You will eat from a rough hand-carved wooden bowl, a piece of what was called treenware, and you will use a spoon carved from wood or animal horn. Forks are a strange, pointy affectation of the Italian rich. They will not be common here for centuries. If you were in a monastery or manor kitchen, you would also have a heavy mortar and pestle of stone or wood, essential for grinding spices to a fine powder or for pounding bread and almonds into a paste for thickening sauces. But here, in the humble hut, your tools are the pot, the spoon, and the fire. This limited toolkit is what gives your cuisine its character. With one pot, almost everything becomes a soup, a stew, a pottage. It is a simple, direct, and unchanging way of cooking. Historians and experimental archaeologists still argue whether the constant day-long simmering of the pottage in the cauldron was also a rudimentary method of water purification. The long boiling would have killed pathogens in the local well or stream water, making it safer to consume. An accidental but life-saving benefit of the one-pot cooking style. You look at this simple scene, the glowing embers, the dark, heavy pot suspended in the smoky air, the quiet bubbling of the soup within. This is a timeless tableau. A cook in the 10th century would have used these same tools, in this same way, as a cook in the 14th century. It is a world of slow, predictable rhythms. But this slow, timeless, simmering world, a world that has persisted for centuries, is about to be shattered. An unimaginable catastrophe is traveling slowly up from the shores of the Mediterranean, an event so swift and so deadly it will change everything. The number of people in the land, the value of work, the way society is structured, and even the simple, humble contents of the cauldron itself. You are standing in that timeless, smoky kitchen, a world of slow, predictable rhythms governed by the seasons and the sun. The cauldron simmers. The fire glows. This is how it has been for centuries. But the great, silent, unchanging world outside your door is about to end. A catastrophe is coming, not with the crash of an invading army, but as a silent, invisible passenger on the trade routes from the east. It arrives in the year 1347. It is the Great Pestilence, the Black Death. It is a terror unlike any you can imagine. It is a fever, a swelling, a darkness that blooms under the skin. It moves with terrifying speed, passing from person to person through the very air, it seems. No one understands it. Is it a punishment from God? A poison in the wells? A malign alignment of the planets? There is no explanation, and there is no cure. The world you know simply begins to die. In the space of a few short years, a third, and in some places, fully half of the population of Europe is gone. It is a demographic collapse of unimaginable scale, a wound cut so deep into the fabric of society that it will change everything, forever. And when the first wave finally recedes, you are standing in the wreckage of a new world. The silence in the villages is deafening. Fields lie fallow, their owners dead. The old certainties are gone. But amid the grief and the trauma, something strange and unprecedented begins to happen. With so many people gone, there is a sudden, desperate shortage of workers. For the first time in centuries, your labor, the work of your hands, is now a scarce and valuable commodity. For the first time in history, the peasant had leverage. Landlords, desperate for men to plow their fields and shear their sheep, are forced to offer better wages and greater freedoms. Many peasants simply abandon the manors where their families had been tied for generations, seeking better pay elsewhere. The old feudal system, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains, begins to crack. It turns out that being part of a drastically reduced workforce is terrible for society as a whole, but pretty good for your individual salary negotiations. This new economic reality has a profound impact on the landscape itself. Landowners can no longer afford to cultivate all their vast fields with labor-intensive grain crops like wheat and barley. So, huge swathes of farmland are converted to something less demanding: pasture. It takes far fewer men to manage a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep than it does to plow, sow, and harvest an ocean of grain. And this shift, from arable farming to animal husbandry, changes what you eat. With more animals being raised, the price of meat and dairy products, beef, pork, butter, cheese, begins to fall. At the same time, with less land growing grain and fewer people to farm it, the price of bread, the old staple of your diet, remains high. Suddenly, a piece of beef or a hunk of cheese is more affordable. The European diet got a sudden, tragic, and significant upgrade. More beef, less pottage. It was the worst and best thing to ever happen to the average person's dinner table. In the wake of the plague, some chroniclers wrote of a strange manic hedonism among the survivors. Life was cheap and unpredictable. Death could come at any moment. So why not enjoy the present? People who inherited land and money from deceased relatives spent it lavishly on better food, finer clothes, and more ale. In this new, emptier, and strangely more prosperous world, the humble snail begins to lose its place. When you can afford a bit of salted pork for your stew, The long, laborious process of foraging for snails, carefully purging them for a week and then slowly cooking them, seems like a lot of effort for very little return. The snail, a food of quiet times of patience and often of necessity, found itself becoming slightly redundant in a world where you could now afford a sausage. It doesn't vanish overnight, of course, but its slow decline from the menu of the common person begins here, in the shadow of the Great Plague. The world has been broken open, and the new world that is beginning to grow in its place will have a new set of tastes, new appetites, and soon, a whole new world of food to discover. The world after the Black Death is a world broken open, a world of new possibilities. The old, rigid structures have been weakened, and a new spirit of inquiry, of art, of science, and of exploration is beginning to take hold. This is the dawn of the Renaissance. And with this new way of looking at the world comes a new way of looking at food. Tastes are changing. In the great kitchens of the Italian and French courts, the medieval love for overwhelming dishes with a dozen different spices begins to fade, replaced by a new desire to taste the main ingredient itself. A fish should taste of the sea, not of ginger and cloves. A vegetable should taste of the earth it grew in. But this subtle shift in elite taste is nothing compared to the cataclysmic event that is about to unfold. Driven by this new spirit of discovery and a desire for new trade routes to the spice lands of the East, European ships push out over the edge of the known world. In 1492, they stumble upon a world they never knew existed. A whole new continent full of new people, new cultures, and new, utterly astonishing edible things was suddenly on the menu. It was the biggest grocery run in history. This event, which we now call the Columbian Exchange, would permanently alter the diet of the entire planet. Over the next few centuries, a slow but unstoppable tide of new ingredients begins to arrive in the ports of Europe. Plants that will change the taste of everything. Imagine you are there, seeing these things for the first time. From the Andes Mountains comes a lumpy, unassuming tuber called the potato. At first, you and your countrymen are deeply suspicious. It's a member of the nightshade family, like the often poisonous belladonna. It's not mentioned in the Bible. It grows underground, which seems unnatural and dirty, but it's incredibly easy to grow, produces a huge yield, and is packed with calories. It will take a long time to catch on, but it is a food of the future. Then there is the tomato. It arrives in Spain and Italy, a beautiful, glossy scarlet fruit. But because of its relation to nightshade, it's immediately classified as an ornamental plant. It's beautiful, it's red, it grows easily, and everyone is absolutely terrified of it. They call it the love apple and believe it to be either a powerful aphrodisiac or a deadly poison. For more than 200 years, people put it on the mantelpiece to look at, but they wouldn't dare put it in a sauce. And there is more. There are new kinds of beans, kidney beans, lima beans, string beans, that are easy to grow, easy to dry, and provide a fantastic source of protein, far more reliable than foraging. There is maize or corn, which can be dried and ground into a meal for a thick porridge, a dish that will become known as polenta in Italy. From the Americas come peppers, both the sweet bell peppers and the fiery chili peppers, which provide a whole new kind of heat, one that can be grown in a European garden instead of being imported at enormous expense from Asia. And for the feast table, there is a magnificent new bird, the turkey. Historians still argue about the speed and process of adoption for these new foods, particularly why the potato, which is so nutritious and easy to grow, faced centuries of resistance from a skeptical and conservative European peasantry. But slowly, inevitably, these new foods begin to take root in the soil and on the plates of Europe. And with every field planted with potatoes, with every pot of hearty bean stew that is cooked, the role of the old medieval survival foods begins to shrink. The humble snail, which had survived the fall of Rome and the Black Death, now faced its greatest existential threat, the potato. Why would you spend a week carefully purging snails when you have a cellar full of potatoes that will keep you fed all winter? Why would you forage for hours for a small basket of snails when a single row of beans in your garden provides far more protein with far less effort? The snail was a creature of the old world, a food of necessity and ancient tradition. This new emerging early modern world was a world of abundance, of new choices, of agricultural efficiency. The snail soup, the rustic pottage of your ancestors, begins to seem old-fashioned, a food of hard times that are best forgotten. The snail is not wiped out, but it is pushed to the margins, becoming a hyper-regional specialty, a quaint memory. Its time as a widespread important part of the European diet is coming to a close. Except that is in one country, where this humble creature was not about to fade away, but was instead preparing for a spectacular and buttery reinvention. As the modern world dawned with its potatoes and its world-spanning trade, the humble snail seemed destined for obscurity, a forgotten relic of a tougher, hungrier time. It was fading from the pots of Europe, a quaint and slightly strange memory. But in France, the snail was not preparing to exit the stage. It was just waiting in the wings for its star turn. The snail was about to get a makeover, a full rebranding. It was leaving its rustic, soupy past behind and entering its glamorous, buttery Parisian era. We travel forward in time now, to the early 19th century. The setting is Paris, the glittering capital of a new Europe, and the cradle of what we now call haute cuisine. This is the age of legendary chefs, the birth of the modern restaurant, and the codification of French gastronomy as the most sophisticated in the world. The snail, at this point, is still considered a rustic, provincial food, something you might eat in the countryside of Burgundy, but certainly not something you would serve at a grand diplomatic dinner in the city. The legend of its transformation, like many food stories, is probably a romanticized blend of fact and fiction, but it centers around a dinner in the year 1814. The guest of honor was Tsar Alexander I of Russia. The host was the cunning French foreign minister, Talleyrand, and in the kitchen was Talleyrand's chef, the brilliant and innovative Marie-Antoine Carême, one of the founding fathers of French high cooking. The story goes that Talleyrand, wishing to present the Tsar with a uniquely French and perhaps slightly challenging dish, tasked Carême with preparing snails. Carême, a culinary genius, understood that the key was not to hide the snail in a thick, lumpy pottage as his peasant ancestors had done. The snail had to be the hero. He decided to create a dish that was decadent, dramatic, and intensely flavorful. First, he took the classic large burgundy snails and poached them until they were perfectly tender. Then, he turned his attention to the flavor delivery system. He created a beurre composé, or compound butter. He took a large amount of the best quality butter and creamed it with a truly heroic quantity of finely minced fresh garlic and vibrant, green, chopped parsley. The amount of garlic and parsley involved was substantial. It was less a butter and more a vibrant green, intensely fragrant paste that just happened to contain butter. He then took the clean, empty snail shells and, using a small spoon or a piping bag, stuffed a generous amount of this powerful garlic parsley butter deep inside. He then pushed the cooked snail into the shell after it and sealed the opening with another thick plug of the butter. These prepared shells were arranged on a platter and slid into a searingly hot oven. They remained there for only a few minutes, just long enough for the butter to melt into a bubbling, sizzling, fragrant green lava. They were brought to the table immediately, the air electrified with the incredible aroma of garlic and butter. The diner would be equipped with a special set of tools, a small two-pronged fork to spear the snail, and a clamp-like tong to hold the scorching hot shell steady. Food historians still argue about the exact origins of the recipe, with some suggesting Carême merely popularized and refined a pre-existing regional preparation from Burgundy, while others credit him with its brilliant invention and introduction to the world of high gastronomy. Whatever the truth, the dish was a sensation. This was Escargot de Bourgogne. It was a complete reinvention. The snail was no longer a humble peasant staple, but an elegant and decadent appetizer. Its success was so complete that an entire set of hardware, special dimpled plates, forks, and tongs, was invented just to accommodate it. The snail had finally made it. It had completed its long journey from Roman appetizer to Dark Age survival food, to Lenten loophole, to medicinal dust, to peasant pottage, and now, at last, to a world-famous symbol of French gourmet cooking. It was no longer something you ate because you had to. It was something you ordered to show that you could. It came with its own tiny fork. That's how you know you're fancy. The modern idea of the snail as food was born, not in a simmering cauldron over a smoky hearth, but in a blast of oven heat and a glorious bath of garlic butter. But with this new, definitive version of the snail now famous the world over, did any of the older, soupier, humbler traditions manage to survive? The invention of Escargots de Bourgogne, with its dazzling garlic parsley butter, was so definitive, so powerfully delicious, that it seems like it should have wiped all other snail recipes off the map. It was the snail's final, perfect form. And yet, if you travel away from the grand restaurants of Paris, away from the tourist track, and deep into the countryside of Europe, you can still find them. The faint, savory ghosts of the older ways. It turns out the snail soup wasn't completely wiped out by garlic butter. It just went into hiding, living a quiet life in the countryside, far from the pressures of Parisian high society. Let's go back to Italy. In a small town in Tuscany during a summer festival, a sagra, dedicated to the local snail or chiocciola, you find it. A huge vat of snails is simmering in a rich, dark red stew. This is the direct descendant of the medieval zuppa di lumache. The base is still a fragrant sofrito of garlic and onions and olive oil, but now it has been enriched with the New World tomato, which finally, after centuries of suspicion, found its true home in Italian cuisine. The broth is scented with rosemary or wild fennel, just as it might have been 700 years ago. It is a robust, rustic, and deeply traditional dish. Now we travel to Spain, to a noisy tapas bar in Andalusia on a hot evening. Here, snails or caracoles are a beloved seasonal treat. They are not large and plump like the Burgundy snail, but small, foraged varieties. They arrive at your table in a simple earthenware bowl, swimming in a light, intensely flavorful broth, seasoned with garlic, herbs like mint or oregano, and sometimes a hint of chili. You are given not a tiny fork but a simple toothpick to pluck the tiny morsels from their shells. It's less a formal meal, and more a delightful, time-consuming activity. The original finger food, provided you don't count the snail's one slimy foot. This communal, informal way of eating is a living echo of the medieval peasant's pot, a shared dish for a community. Even in France, the kingdom of garlic butter, older traditions persist. In the Catalan region of the south, you might find a cargalade. Here, dozens of snails are cooked on a huge, flat metal grill over a fire of dried grapevine cuttings. They are seasoned simply with salt and pepper and served with a big bowl of aioli, a strong garlic mayonnaise. This tradition of grilling is a direct link back to the very earliest ways of cooking snails, the simple roasting practiced by the Romans. Elsewhere in a farmhouse kitchen, you might still find a simple fricassee d'escargot, a stew made with salty bacon bits, lardons, wild mushrooms, and a splash of white wine, a clear descendant of the rustic peasant soups that predated Carême's famous invention. These dishes are the culinary equivalent of finding a Roman coin in a field. They are a direct, tangible link to a much older way of eating. Folklorists and food historians still argue whether these surviving regional dishes are true fossils of medieval recipes, or if they have been continuously evolving, subtly influenced by changing tastes and the introduction of new ingredients over the centuries. But their soul, their essence, remains connected to the past. This connection is made even clearer when you look at where the snail has vanished. In England and Germany, the lands of hesitant curiosity and medicinal dust, the snail has almost entirely disappeared from the menu. The medieval cultural aversion has held firm for centuries. These surviving pockets of snail cookery are beautiful and delicious, but they are the exception. In a tiny village in Crete, they still cook snails in a way that is likely thousands of years old, frying them live in hot olive oil and rosemary. In Italy and Spain, annual snail festivals draw huge crowds. These traditions are a testament to the deep regional roots of European food, but they are islands of memory in a modern sea. The world has changed. The days when snail soup was a common everyday food, a life-sustaining pottage simmering in the pots of the poor from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, are long gone. That tradition, once so widespread, has been slowly, quietly, fading away. We have seen the echoes of the old ways, the surviving islands of tradition where the snail is still stewed and celebrated. But these are the exceptions. For the vast majority of Europe, the story of the snail soup is one of a long, slow, and quiet disappearance. It is a tradition that did not die in a dramatic cataclysm, but simply faded from memory, like a dream upon waking. Let's watch it happen. You are in the 15th century in the generation after the Black Death. Your family is better off. There is more meat, more cheese. You still make snail soup when the rains are heavy in the autumn, but it is no longer a desperate necessity. It is a taste of the old times, something your grandmother was famous for. The tradition is still alive, but it is becoming optional. Now a century or two passes. The world is awash with the new foods from the Americas. In the small garden plot behind your family's cottage, there are now rows of potatoes and hardy beans. These are the new staples. They are reliable. They can be stored through the long winter and they fill the belly. The ancient intricate knowledge of foraging, the mental map of the best snail hunting spots, the wisdom of which wild greens are safe and which are not, is still passed down, but with less urgency. It is becoming folklore, a charming skill rather than a vital tool for survival. Your children listen, but perhaps not as closely as you listened to your parents. Then comes the final decisive change. It is the 19th century, and the world is growing louder, faster, and smokier. The Industrial Revolution has arrived. The common lands where your ancestors foraged are being enclosed for commercial sheep grazing. And the lure of paid work, of a life away from the crushing, unpredictable rhythm of the harvest is too strong to ignore. Your great-great-great-grandson leaves the ancestral village. He and his new family now live in a crowded, noisy city, in a small tenement room. His idea of foraging is finding a decent loaf of bread that isn't stale. The family has moved up, sort of. His connection to the land is completely severed. There are no damp woods here, no mossy monastery walls. His food comes not from the earth, but from a stall in a dirty market, bought with the meager wages he earns at the textile mill. The very idea of making a snail soup is an impossibility, a relic of a life that no longer exists. The specific knowledge of which mushroom will kill you is replaced by the specific knowledge of how to operate a weaving loom without losing a finger. The tradition, once a lifeline, has become irrelevant. In this era, a new kind of scholar, the folklorist, might travel to your family's old, now emptying village. He might interview the oldest residents, writing down their stories and recipes in a little notebook. He is trying to preserve the memory of a vanishing world. He writes down a recipe for a simple snail pottage, thickened with stale bread and flavored with wild thyme. It is the first time the recipe has ever been written down, and it is happening at the precise moment it is ceasing to be a part of anyone's daily life. Sociologists and historians still argue about the true impact of urbanization on folk traditions, questioning whether they truly die or if they simply go dormant, waiting to be rediscovered. But for all intents and purposes, the everyday snail soup has been officially retired. It has received its golden pocket watch and has been sent off to a quiet life in the pages of a dusty folklore journal. The common peasant's pot, which simmered with this humble earthy soup for 1,000 years, is now used to boil potatoes, or it has been sold for scrap, replaced by a cheap metal pan on a small cast-iron stove. The world that created the snail soup has gone, and the soup has, quietly and without ceremony, gone with it. And so our long, slow journey through the centuries finally comes to a gentle close. We have seen the rise and fall of empires, the spread of new ideas and new flavors, all through the lens of one of the humblest creatures on earth. You can let the images begin to soften now. The vibrant colors of the noble saffron soup and the earthy greens of the peasant pottage can all blur together, fading into the soft, warm darkness of the fireside. That single, heavy cauldron, which has hung at the center of our story for so long, now hangs still and silent over a fire that is burning low. The bubbling of the soup has ceased. The last of the wood has been consumed, its bright dancing flames giving way to a deep, pulsating bed of soft orange embers. The light in the small hut grows dim, the shadows deepen, and the only sound now is the gentle settling of the ash and the soft, quiet rhythm of your own breathing. The last ember winks out, surrendering to the darkness. All of the work is done. All of the stories have been told. There is nothing left to do now but rest. The world is quiet. The night is deep, and you are safe and warm and ready for sleep.